Welcome home, frequent and first-time viewers alike. It's your girl QB, quarterbacking the biggest artist of all time. If you think there's a debate for anybody not named Michael Joseph Jackson, let me run some numbers by you. More than 400 million albums sold worldwide, 13 Billboard Hot 100 #1 singles, and the distinction of being the first artist to have a top 10 single on the Billboard Hot 100 in 5 different decades. Not to mention 15 Grammys, a Golden Globe, and a mind-bending 39 Guinness World Records. Hold on, I'm almost done. When we're talking about the Hall of Fame, you might think of sports, you might think of the Grammys, but MJ needs to be inducted into the Hall of Fame's Hall of Fame. He's been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, the Vocal Group Hall of Fame, the R&B Music Hall of Fame. He even has the singular achievement of being the only recording artist in the Dance Hall of Fame. That last one needs some new inductees, but that's besides the point. Today we're ranking his albums from worst to first. Note, this list won't be including any Jackson 5 albums, compilations, or those forgettable posthumous joints that may actually have been AI before AI was AI. Long story, but that's enough for the introduction. Like, subscribe, share. Let's get to it. Recorded during a rather chaotic point in his career, a young Michael was audibly going through puberty. Seeing idols like Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye break through as songwriters and composers, at this point Mike was struggling to sell records on his own. Between his stifled creativity, the limited promotion for the album amidst the Jackson 5 World Tour, and Motown's inability to draw on Jackson's innate superstar talent, it would unknowingly be the catalyst for Poppinger Joe Jackson to move both Michael and the Jackson 5 to Epic Records. One of the most impressive qualities of early Motown recordings was Berry Gordy's circus-like abilities to juggle successful acts. The 60s saw the rise of popular artists like Marvin Gaye, the Supremes, the Temptations, and the Miracles all coexisting in harmony. Fast forward to the Jackson 5's meteoric ascent, and it was clear that the workload was getting to be a bit much for the Motor City mogul. Music and Me would barely get a chance to leave the runway before being grounded in favor of the Jackson 5's surprise hit, Dancing Machine. In what would become a running gag during his time at Motown, Michael would inexplicably be marketed as an extension of the Jackson 5, which created some obvious tension. That's because it not only made fans feel as if buying a Michael record was oversaturation, but also had critics taking aim at a teenager with no creative control over his own sound. While we understand why Jackson's solo career is largely relegated to his final 6 albums, the problem with omitting his early material lies in also disregarding the gems that are then forgotten to history. With A Child's Heart, Up Again, and the title track Music and Me, for example. What are the best parts about a Motown record? They're going to be short, sweet, and to the point. So even if a teenage Michael isn't your musical bread and butter, these records never elapse 36 minutes. Ideally, we take the best 2 or 3 songs from each album and turn that work into a standalone project. Upon critical reviews of Jackson's 3rd LP, it's clear everyone could hear Michael's disinterest, which certainly contributed to the lowest sales of his career. Music and Me ultimately fails to move the needle by failing to see Jackson as a dedicated and talented artist worth developing. Number 9, Forever Michael. No longer Little Michael Jackson, the king of pop's transition into adulthood wasn't quite as abrupt as people remember. The last puzzle piece Jackson would assemble before splitting from Motown. Technically, that's moving violation with the Jackson 5, but you get the point. Forever Michael would see the star shelve his solo ambitions for more than 4 years, releasing 4 Jackson 5 albums in between this and Off the Wall. Normally, an artist letting their buzz cool off after dropping underwhelming works would be an easy way to lose your edge. In Michael's case, it turned out to be the best strategic play he could make. Losing significant ground with Music and Me, struggling to peak inside the top 100, Jackson's 4th LP failed to even match its predecessor. Part of that was Gordy's refusal to understand the soundscape of the time, with socio-political unrest permeating the works of artists like Marvin Gaye. It's also worth mentioning that Gaye fought to have such themes present in his work, to the chagrin and pleasant surprise of Gordy, who believed that political material wouldn't sell and was disabused of that notion. The other part was the fatigue that came with being a child star. That is, the earlier an artist was introduced, the longer they needed to maintain and engage their audience. And audiences then, as today, can be impatient and lose trust in the process of artistic development. So while Michael is still years ahead of his time in terms of quality and output, the usual leap that we could expect to see from an artist a decade in the game couldn't happen the same way for MJ. The timelines couldn't account for an otherworldly talent at such a young age. Where most artists would be hitting their stride around the 10-year mark, Jackson was in the middle of high school. It's hard to bridge the gap when you're much younger than your musical peers, but even more experienced than your real-life counterparts. This is why we see Michael struggling to move units in a much more noticeable decline than the Jackson family groups. We get some of his most underrated vocal performances on surprises like We're Almost There, One Day in Your Life, and Take Me Back, but the album falls into that untenable gray area of broke but not knowing how to fix it. That being said, there's one song in particular that sparked our interest throughout this latest deep dive. We're searching for a good sample, so when JPEG flipped Dear Michael for his collab with Danny Brown, Orange Juice Jones, we almost did a spit take. While we would encourage listeners to do their own due diligence with the album, its importance lies more so in demonstrating growth on Off the Wall, rather than as a memorable offering from Motown Records that was going downhill with no breaks. Number 8, Ben. housing one of the most unusually successful title tracks you'll ever come across. Not only would this slow-tempo dedication to a childhood friend top the charts in 2 different countries, it would win a Golden Globe while securing an Oscar nomination for Best Song. Michael had already cemented his place in the record books, becoming the youngest artist to ever record a #1 with the Jackson 5, I Want You Back, but Ben almost had him holding the solo record too. Even though the song would become one of the most re-released, reviews at the time were rather inconsistent, with some critics praising Mike's vocal range and soft touch, and others claiming the song was too dense and melancholic. It would only spend 1 week atop the charts, but sometimes a week can make the difference of a lifetime. We're not thrilled with the record's 5 covers of previously released material, although his rendition of My Girl is oddly fitting of how we envisioned the original. In Our Small Way was also recycled from Got to Be There. Therein lies the problem with this record. When taking a hard look at the album, you could argue we're only getting a smattering of new material surrounded by Michael's impression of peers and competing artists at the time. Also keep in mind, his cover of Stevie's Shoo-Be-Doo didn't do him many favors and only drew further comparisons to the child prodigy. We're glad the trend of covering contemporaneous classics isn't as prevalent. We enjoy hearing creative takes on well-known staples, but 5 covers on a 10-track album just does both parties a disservice. Sometimes a classic is a classic regardless of who performs it, but more often than not, fans are flocking to the song like People Make the World Go Round because they love the stylistic sound. Hence, the original becoming a dope Rick Ross flip, while MJ's cover is a footnote in one of the greatest discographies ever. Our theory is that Ben enjoyed more critical and commercial success than Gordy and his production team anticipated, then they scrambled to build an album around that song. Listeners wanted to hear Michael singing new material. Numbers don't lie, but you don't get off the wall Michael had he not reached the mountaintop before crashing back down to earth. Number 7, Got to Be There. Released on the back end of the Jackson 5's prolific but brief run between 1969 and 1971, Michael's debut was a breath of fresh air for audiences that were experiencing a burnout on Motown's signature sound. Although not an initial home run critically or commercially, the album would confirm that Jackson had both talent and appeal in droves. The singer's sincerity and uncanny ability to embody the writings of artists like Bill Withers and Willie Hutch almost convinced listeners across the country he was wise beyond his 13 years. In the hands of artists like Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Marvin Gaye, or the Temptations, these songs would have been fairly successful standards for the period, but little Michael probably benefited as much as he suffered from the initial gimmick of child singers at the time. I Want to Be Where You Are, Rockin' Robin, and lead single Got to Be There thread the needle between age-appropriate love songs and era-friendly plug-and-play ballads. Basically, Berry Gordy and company knew their product, knew their audience, and knew how to merge the two. We think certain cuts on here would have actually done better in the hands of other artists, but that's not a slight. Just saying, if we could pick between a 13-year-old Mike singing Ain't No Sunshine or a 32-year-old Marvin, we're probably taking Marvin on that one. Despite most artists using the debut as a testing ground for the direction they should take moving forward, but Got to Be There can't be condensed into a song or two, including the aforementioned essentials. Gems like Wings of My Love, You've Got a Friend, and Maria see Michael demonstrating his willingness to fill out all 10 tracks instead of being fully reliant on a song or two carrying the momentum of the LP's runtime. While we could even entertain arguments moving this album up a spot higher on the list, we feel comfortable calling his solo debut his adolescent peak. If you're looking for a benchmark of Jackson's creativity, maturity, or commercial crossover, this isn't quite the album for you. But if you want to hear a Michael whose raw potential effortlessly seeps through records, a Michael who could unwaveringly focus on the task of singing timelessly crafted pieces and see his rise to entertainment's chief innovator, start from the beginning. Number 6, Invincible. Are y'all familiar with the term progressive overload? It refers to the concept of working your muscles to failure. You know, no pain, no gain. Well, this album is proof that even Michael wasn't immune to such musical fatigue. We've seen artists like TLC and Toni Braxton get screwed out of millions due to predatory practices on the industry's business end. We've even seen an artist like Prince go through a symbolic rebrand to wrestle power away from his label. But we've never seen an artist record the most expensive album in history before promptly refusing to tour with it. With a reported budget of $30 million, that's more than $51 million 2023 money. The King of Pop is believed to have recorded the most expensive album ever made. That number was crazy even before we accounted for inflation, right? The relationship between Michael and Tommy Mottola, then CEO of Sony Music, was so bad, Jackson called Tommy a devil and a racist who exploitatively profited from his artists. Apparently, Mike was supposed to get his masters back at the turn of the decade, but the lawyer who negotiated the deal on his behalf also worked for Sony, which created a conflict of interest Jackson knew nothing about. In an ominous bit of foreshadowing, Jackson would accuse both the record company and music industry of blackballing the project just a few years before a similar situation would go down with his baby sis Janet after her Super Bowl performance. Hey, he did try to warn us. Between the budget, the album's 4-year recording process, and box office stars like Chris Tucker and Marlon Brando around, we would understand if you thought we were describing a cinematic blockbuster. Nope, just Michael's exorbitant approach to music making. Anybody who's given his catalog a spin can tell you he's all about duality. So while we get the record-setting feats of this album, we also get back-to-back features from Fats and a repurposed big verse from Shaq's You Can't Stop the Rain. Since we'll probably never cover Diesel's catalog on this channel, can't we just take a minute to appreciate that he was the only artist to work with Big, Jay, and Nas on the same project? So there's that. Invincible is probably as far from being a classic record as it is from being mediocre. Upon its release, the album would receive fallout from fans and critics. While it would age better in people's minds post-influence dispersal, it failed to meet the quotas of quality, impact, or longevity. Lead single You Rock My World would peak at number 10 on the Hot 100, his last to do so in his lifetime. It would also earn him a nomination for Best Male Pop Vocal Performance at the O2 Grammys. We don't know who on the committee awarded James Taylor for his rendition of a 30-year-old song he had already recorded, but whoever you are, we hope it keeps you up at night. Number 5, History. Before we even get into this album, it's important you understand how massive an undertaking the project really is. Packaged as a double disc, Mike treats fans to his greatest hits on the first CD before rolling out his 9th studio album on the second. Probably an attempt to solidify his earnings for when his masters reverted back, right? Spanning genres like R&B, pop, hip-hop, and rock, Jackson elevated the aggressive sounds and elements introduced on Dangerous while combating the same media that had propelled him to global superstardom. We think this frustration shifted something in Michael. While not to the same degree of a Biggie album, History would be the first noticeable use of profanity in Michael's career. Touching on topics new and old, MJ delves into themes of greed, isolation, environmental awareness, and injustice. Features include Sister Janet, Notorious B.I.G., Slash from Guns N' Roses, and Shaquille O'Neal. While there are subtle signs of a decline on the horizon, the King of Pop was slowly starting to show the toll that the crown demanded. From music videos and album covers to tours and features, Michael was a full-fledged perfectionist who spared no expense rolling out the best product possible. So we were a bit lost when he tapped Shaq for the unofficial sequel to Bad, titled Too Bad. 7 of the album's 15 songs would be released as singles, with many reaching Guinness World Record levels of success. Enlisting go-to musical savants Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis behind the boards, Mike and Janet cement their legacy as the greatest sibling duo in entertainment history. A bit much? Wait until you realize they had the first top 5 debut in Billboard history, debuting at number 5 on the Hot 100. You Are Not Alone would follow suit, becoming the first ever single to debut at number 1. Throw in They Don't Care About Us, Stranger in Moscow, Money, and Smile, and it's clear that even 60% of prime MJ is still miles ahead of the competition. You Are Not Alone is just as impactful as it's complicated. We'd be lying if we said we didn't have mixed feelings on Robert being the one to come to Mike's defense. The single would be MJ's 13th and final chart topper. You know your musical royalty when you legit have an album full of number 1 hits. Kells would be sued for plagiarism by brothers Edward and Daniel Van Passel out of Belgium, with some fans even claiming the original melody also could have been inspired by I Believe I Can Fly. Clearly a video for a different day. Mike would later kick off the History World Tour, which raked in $165 million. In 2023, that's about $314 million. The tour would be the highest grossing solo tour of the 90s. Yeah, even in a decade that saw more valleys than peaks, both professionally and personally, MJ managed to have the most successful tour and one of the most successful albums of the decade. And we haven't even covered the truly iconic material. Number 4, Dangerous.
We know what it means as a team, but what about individually for you?
Just got one more than Shaq.
These had to be Michael's thoughts down to a T. After having the most successful decade in music history, MJ and Quincy Jones went their separate ways following the unquantifiable success of Bad. What was the first thing on people's minds? Can he do it without him? Mr. Jones was already an established composer and arranger before ever meeting Michael, working with jazz legends like Frank Sinatra and Count Basie. Michael, on the other hand, while finding international success as lead singer of the Jackson 5, only hit his stride as a solo artist after Quincy Jones took over the production duties. So even though Jackson faced monumental expectations in his attempt to follow up the best-selling album of all time, we think Dangerous serves as a singular most important moment of his adult career. If he failed, Quincy would say, I told you so. Even if he rolled out a solid album, the chances of eclipsing the success he had with Jones were microscopically slim. Not to mention, in the time since his last release with Quincy, Little Sister Janet had dramatically closed the gap between their two careers, sitting on the throne as the most sought-after pop star on the planet. Yeah, we know it's not a competition. To most people though, this will be a lose-lose situation, unless your name is Michael Joseph Jackson. And Enlisting literal royalty, the features on the album include Princess Stephanie of Monaco, Slash, Rex and Effects, and Heavy D. Fun fact, Heavy D would hold the exclusive title of being the only recording artist to work with both Janet Jackson when featuring on All Right Remix from Rhythm Nation, and Michael Jackson with bars on Jam from Dangerous. In addition to the VIP list of features, Jackson crafted the album's new Jack sound with producers Teddy Riley, Bill Bottrell, and Bruce Sweden. Leaving no room for doubt, MJ's Dangerous would sell 5 million copies in the first week, eventually selling more than 30 million copies worldwide. Receiving global praise for his rejuvenated sound, Dangerous would host 4 top 10 singles, including the chart topper Black or White. Yes, the album earned 4 Grammy nominations, including a win for Best Engineering Non-Classical Album, but what was even more astounding was his Grammy Legend Award. Being introduced in 1990, Jackson was the 10th artist to receive the award, with the other 9 artists ranging from 10 to 26 years his senior. Keep in mind, Jackson already had 26 years in the industry by the time he was 35. Number 3, Off the Wall. Let's set the stage. The year is 1979. The Jackson 5 left Motown for Epic 3 years prior, now recording under the name The Jacksons. Michael's solo career, although successful, has certainly hit a rough patch. We've seen time and time again, music is one of humanity's most persistently evolving art forms. The 1960s saw Motown systematically reinvent the way that music was written, recorded, and marketed. The 1970s saw that same revolutionary approach become formulaic and outdated. In comes musical makeover extraordinaire Quincy Jones, and boom. Michael's sound, songwriting, and image go from stalling teenage heartthrob to a polished vet with 15 years of experience under his belt. Grabbing his first chart-topping single since Ben, Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, put the world on notice. This was not your typical Michael release. Getting in while the getting was good, MJ and Quincy blend disco, funk, pop, and R&B to create one of music's most recognizable examples of a genreless entry. Michael set out to create an album that didn't sound like a Jackson 5 record, intending for Off the Wall to be a showcase of his individuality and creative freedom. What would that freedom look like? Picture this, you recorded 4 albums in a 4-year span, releasing more than 3 dozen songs in that same 4 dozen months, without a single writing credit. Producer credits? None of those either. So when Off the Wall was being conceived, you know Jackson wanted to be more than just the voice behind the record. He would get sole writing credits on Don't Stop Till You Get Enough and Working Day and Night, with a co-writing credit on Get on the Floor with Louis Johnson, another beneficiary of the Quincy Jones machine. All 3 of these songs will also see Jackson getting co-production credits, validating Jackson's insistence on getting out from behind Motown's prepackaged rollouts. Paul McCartney and Stevie Wonder would each pen a song for the album, but it was Quincy's steady hand behind the boards that would truly solidify the album's cohesion and breakthrough quality. The 1979 LP didn't enjoy the same commercial success as his releases between Thriller and History, but is still frequently mentioned in conversations surrounding his greatest work. While staples like She's Out of My Life, I Can't Help It, and Rock With You are constantly in our rotations, we do find the album's disco-oriented sound to be a bit repetitive and limiting at times. Just listen to the tracks like Burn This Disco Out, Get on the Floor, and Girlfriend, and tell us they don't sound like repeats off the album. Go ahead. One thing we have to touch base on is that Rock With You music video. Rock With You would not only show MJ the Tool's viability, we believe it was partly responsible for MTV's creation as a whole. Michael was on the precipice of global superstardom, and it was clear videos were going to help propel him there. So somebody had the bright idea to create a platform specifically for such videos. Videos that would be as innovative and creative as they were primitive in retrospect. While the album falls just at the top of our short list, we wouldn't be surprised or mad if some of you had this at the top of your ranking. It would be inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame after all. Number 2, Bad. Sporting a record-breaking 5 #1 singles on the same album, to say Michael and Quincy ended their partnership on a high note would be an understatement. Jackson's first solo world tour, the Bad Tour, would gross $308 million in today's dollars, 125 back then, making it the most successful solo tour of the 80s. Didn't we say that already? That was the most successful tour of the 90s. My bad. Just went through a little bit of deja vu. It's weird to even think about it, but this would be Jackson's last tour performed on the mainland United States. The album would sell more than 2 million copies in the first week, before climbing to eventual sales of more than 35 million worldwide units sold. You guessed it. It's also on that list of best-selling albums of all time. Eminem said something along the lines of, I sound like a broken record every time I break a record, but MJ was really putting up numbers that would make Wilt Chamberlain scratch his head. All before the benefits of streaming, so we have to tip our hat. The album would draw comparisons to Thriller, understandably so, but the sound and direction that MJ and Quincy took on this project would make it hard for those comparisons to stick. Yes, we see parallels between songs like Bad, The Way You Make Me Feel, and Dirty Diana, being similar to Beat It, PYT, and Billie Jean respectively, but the album does a phenomenal job of standing alone amongst its catalog that we can appreciate what it has to offer without getting hung up on the idea of a similar group of musicians making similar sounding music. After all, Jackson's seamless blend of pop, rock, R&B, and dance music would lead to his eventual crowning as the king of pop. With 5 #1 singles on the same album, was that even a question? We do get features from Stevie Wonder and Syda Garrett, but Michael clearly still kept the collaborations in the pocket, trusting that very few people could comprehend, yet alone add to his vision. Adding Adding another 7 Grammy nominations to his tally, the album surprisingly missed out on all the major awards. In that year that saw Bad competing with Whitney by Whitney Houston, U2 would ultimately take home Album of the Year for the Joshua Tree. If you've been under a rock in the middle of nowhere and still managed to avoid listening to the album, be sure to check out the highlights like The Way You Make Me Feel, Dirty Diana, Man in the Mirror, and Smooth Criminal. Can we stop and take a moment to appreciate and question Jackson's decision to not have the title track also be the album's lead single? Despite going for an edgier and more assertive sound, the album's lead single was I Just Can't Stop Loving You, which also went #1. We're not mad at it, just curious as to why he wanted to kick off his rebrand with one of the most iconic love duets of the decade. Before we get to #1, can we talk about the collab that never came to be? Was intended to be a duet with lifelong musical sparring partner Prince Rogers Nelson. But after reading the opening line, Prince laughably stated that it wouldn't work, regardless of who started it off. Prince would submit his own song, Wouldn't You Love to Love Me, but Jackson rejected it. I guess it was just wishful thinking to have two of the biggest stars of all time collaborating at their respective peaks. Let us know down in the comments what song you think the two could have collaborated on. We would have loved to hear Prince on Come Together, or Mike hopping on The Most Beautiful Girl in the World. #1, Thriller. After the breakthrough solo success of Off the Wall, Mike wanted to create an album where every song was a killer, and he did just that. With 7 of the record's 9 tracks released as singles, they all reached the top 10 on the Hot 100, setting a record for the most top 10 singles from a single album. Lead single The Girl Is Mine would feature Paul McCartney, the first credited feature on a Michael Jackson album, but certainly not the last. Beat It and Billie Jean would go on to top the charts, with the latter's performance at the Motown 25 television special ushering in his signature step, the moonwalk. In addition to the vocal innovation found throughout the project, Thriller would be credited for popularizing music videos as promotional tools, winning a record 8 Grammys for the album. Jackson would walk away with trophies for Record of the Year, Album of the Year, as well as Best Pop and R&B Male Vocal Performance. If you ask 9 different people what their favorite song off the album is, you're more likely than not to get 9 different answers. While songs like Wanna Be Starting Something, PYT, and Billie Jean are immortalized in musical lore, it's something different about Human Nature. The alleged story behind the song is enough to give you goosebumps. Originally written by keyboardist Steve Porcaro, the song stemmed from a conversation with his first grade daughter, trying to explain why a boy at her school would have hit her. Porcaro told her he probably liked you, and it's human nature. Porcaro and some bandmates from the group Toto were helping out with production of Thriller, but Human Nature wasn't even on their radar. Quincy inadvertently heard the demo, enlisted John Bettis for some revisions, and the rest is history. More like past, present, and future. The song has been sampled by artists like Nas, SWV, Chris Brown, Big Sean, and more. Even Drake and Usher have an unreleased song floating on the internet titled Slow Motion that perfectly captures the song's fluidity. It's about as close to a guaranteed classic sample as a song can get. We could have just said that Miles Davis covered the song, and that would have more than sufficed to get its impact across, but where's the fun in that? By the end of 1983, Thriller had sold more than 30 million copies. It would be ratified by Guinness World Records on February 7, 1984, and hasn't looked back since. Even divorcing Thriller from its commercial success and critical accolades, there's no denying the album's immense quality and impact. MJ created the blueprint for the flawless album. We're not even saying the project is without flaws, but artists had completely different approaches to making music before its release, essentially creating 2 time periods in music. There's before Thriller and there's after. Before, artists would get an exceptional song or two and build around them. We're talking the Isley Brothers' 3+3, Marvin Gaye's I Want You, or Diana Ross's Diana. All seminal bodies of work that knew how to prop up those catalog staples. After Thriller, we get a flurry of artists trying to release what ultimately amounts to an intentionally crafted greatest hit. Think Nas's Illmatic, Janet's Control, or Usher's Confessions. These albums would have normally spread such densely prolific material across an entire catalog. Instead, MJ showed just how valuable an album like Thriller could be across different genres and generations. If that isn't cause for a greatest album in your catalog, we don't know what is. Alright theories, you know what to do. Get active in the comments, show that like button some love, and spar with that super thanks. With all the heat we've been cooking up, you're helping to keep the AC on. Go check out our Janet ranking and let us know who should we spotlight next.